In order to understand how the British came to have such an overwhelming presence in the American colonies, we have to go back to the early 1500s and the royal dynasty, the Tudors, and in particular, Henry VIII. This is Henry. This is Henry's older brother, Arthur. This is Henry and Arthur's parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. This is Catherine of Aragon. These are her parents, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. They rule Spain. Henry and Elizabeth agree with Ferdinand and Isabella that Arthur, the elder son who is next in line to the throne, should marry Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter, Catherine. Now, royal marriages were less a romantic affair and generally more about power and regional consolidation. A marriage between Prince Arthur and Catherine could be seen to benefit both Spain and England in unifying two powerful Catholic regions. So, they were married on November 14th, 1501. But only 5 months later, Arthur dies, probably of tuberculosis, and since Arthur is dead, this power merger essentially dies with him. So Arthur's parents, King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and Catherine's parents, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, work out an agreement whereby they will attempt to have the marriage annulled and then have Catherine marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry. Now, the Pope agrees to the annulment on the basis that, according to Catherine, the marriage to Arthur was never consummated. They never had sex because Arthur was too ill throughout the entirety of the few months that they were together. With the marriage annulled, Henry is now able to marry Catherine. The problem is Henry is like 10. So they drag the process out for several years while the parents arrange for the exchange of monies. Henry was to send Ferdinand and Isabella large amounts of gold, and a dowry was to come from Catherine's parents to King Henry VII and Elizabeth. Finally, everything is in place when just a few weeks before the wedding, Henry VII dies. His son, Henry VIII, ascends to the throne, and the new 16-year-old king marries Catherine, 6 years his senior. How do they get along? Well, it turns out they get along pretty well, and in fact, it appears they are genuinely in love. And as king, what is the one thing Henry or any king wants most from his queen? A male heir. And Catherine delivers one, but the infant dies 2 months later. Henry consoles himself by going to war with France. This is a recurring theme between England and France. Whenever there's a lull in the action, they go to war with each other. Catherine then gives birth to a daughter, Mary, but still, Henry has no son. Mary Tudor is the center of attention as the young princess. She's a happy and pretty young girl. And Henry is with Catherine for over 20 years, but as it becomes apparent she won't be delivering any more children, Henry starts having serious doubts about the marriage. He grows to believe that he had no sons because God was punishing him for having married his brother's wife. Henry decides to seek an annulment to his marriage from Catherine and approached the Pope, who said it was absurd. They'd been married for 24 years and had conceived children. So it was impossible for the church to suggest the marriage had never existed. Henry argued, citing a biblical passage, Leviticus 20:21, that his marriage to Catherine was unclean because she was the widow of his brother Arthur, but the Pope is unmoved by this argument. Now, additionally, Pope Clement may have been reluctant to act because he was influenced by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who happened to be Catherine's nephew. So Catherine refused to grant Henry a divorce or retire to a convent. The Pope won't grant an annulment, so Henry decides instead to divorce England from the Catholic Church, become the head of his own church, the Church of England, and grant his own annulment. And that's what he does. With the marriage to Catherine formally declared void, Catherine was demoted to Dowager Princess of Wales, a title she would have held as the widow of Henry's brother, Arthur, and removed from the castle, paving the way for Henry to remarry. Henry had long ago decided he would marry Anne Boleyn. A few years earlier, Anne's sister, Mary, had attracted the king's attention and became his mistress. When Henry took notice of Anne, Henry asked her to become his mistress, but she refused because he was a married man. Henry was determined to win Anne Boleyn, and after getting his divorce, the couple secretly married after Anne had become pregnant. The king's second marriage was not popular. Many people believed that Anne was a witch and had cast a spell on Henry. When their baby was born, Henry was again upset that, once again, the baby was not a boy. His new daughter was named Elizabeth. Now, if Henry's first marriage technically never existed, what does that make Mary? It makes her the bastard child. She's born out of wedlock, technically, and he's essentially deemed illegitimate. So the title of princess is stripped away, and her new title becomes the Lady Mary. As England is no longer tied to the Catholic Church, Elizabeth was the new and only legitimate princess. Mary refused to acknowledge that Anne Boleyn was the queen or that Elizabeth was a princess. Well, this enrages King Henry. The relationship between Mary and her father worsened, and they didn't speak to each other for 3 years. Henry and his wife Anne began arguing. Although Anne became pregnant twice more, each time the babies were stillborn. By this time, Henry is getting tired of Anne and wanted to get rid of her. He had no intention of waiting for a divorce, so his ministers invented evidence showing that Anne had been unfaithful and had plotted Henry's death. Now, there is nothing to show any of it was true. She was found guilty, and Henry had her head cut off. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was a quiet, shy girl who attracted Henry because she was so different from his first 2 wives, Catherine and Anne. He was 45 years old, and Jane was 28. Although Henry became concerned when Jane did not become pregnant immediately, he was thrilled when she finally did give birth to a son, Edward. Henry pictured the perfect family. However, due to complications of childbirth, Jane died a month later. Henry was grief-stricken as he seemed to be genuinely in love with Jane. In fact, many years later, and many wives later, on his deathbed, she was the wife Henry asked to be buried next to. Nonetheless, Henry finally had his male heir. After the death of Jane, Henry remained single for 2 years. He had the son he had wanted for so long, and although Edward was weak and sickly, he did survive. Having broken free from Rome in the 1530s, England was isolated from much of Europe, and Henry's advisors thought it would be a good idea for him to marry a German princess and make an alliance with the other great Protestant nation in Europe. 2 suitable princesses were chosen, and the famous painter Hans Holbein was sent to paint their portraits. The girls were sisters and daughters of the Duke of Cleves. Based on the portraits he was shown, Henry chose the older daughter, Anne, to be his 4th wife. Now, the 24-year-old German princess arrived in England, and Henry was horrified when he saw her. She looked nothing like the portrait. It's kind of like on a dating app when you meet somebody and they look nothing like their picture, and you're like, whoa, this is not cool. Well, was that picture taken from a bridge or something? Is that a satellite photo? Anyway, Henry demanded his ministers find him a way out of the marriage, but they couldn't do it. So the marriage went ahead, and Henry is unable to consummate that marriage. The couple divorced amicably 6 months later, and actually Anne is well provided for and lived out her days in England in comfort. She outlived Henry and died in 1557. Henry had chosen his 5th wife before his divorce to Anne of Cleves was even finalized. Wife number 5, Catherine Howard, was the cousin of his 2nd wife, Anne Boleyn, and she was 15. Henry was 49, overweight and unable to walk far due to his weight and an injury to his leg that had festered and refused to heal. Catherine was young, lively, and flirtatious. She was soon bored with having a fat old husband and sought out young friends. Now, unfortunately for Catherine, one of these young friends in question was a guy who had known Catherine before her marriage. He knew that, supposedly, she was no virgin when she married, and he used this to bribe her into getting him a good position in the royal court. Eventually, within a couple of years, Catherine is accused of adultery, and after 2 years of marriage, she suffered the same fate as her cousin Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, and she too is beheaded. Henry married wife number 6, Catherine Parr, who was twice widowed and a kindly lady who proved to be a good stepmother to the king's 3 children. She was also an excellent nursemaid and caretaker, and bathed Henry's leg wound and comforted him when he was sick. She came close to being tried for treason when her enemies attempted to prove that she was not devoted to the Church of England. However, she managed to convince Henry that she was loyal to him and his church and was spared. After Henry's death, she married Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, and died in childbirth in 1548. Henry VIII died in 1547, and 9-year-old Prince Edward succeeded him. Though technically king, a council ruled on Edward's behalf until he was old enough to truly carry out the duties of the monarchy. Henry's will had decreed that if Edward were to bear no children, Mary would ascend to the throne, and if Mary died childless, Elizabeth would be next in line to the throne. Now, all of these things would naturally be considered long-shot contingencies, but it's exactly what happens. Edward ends up dying young, probably of tuberculosis at the age of 15. Now, according to his father's wishes, the throne should therefore have been passed to Mary. The thing is, Edward did not want the crown to go to Mary because he feared, quite rightly, that she would try to restore England to Catholicism, which would mean Henry's first marriage was never annulled, and Mary would no longer be the bastard child, and her reign as queen would be legitimized. This would therefore make Henry an illegitimate son and heir, and undo the Protestant reforms of Henry VIII. And so Edward planned to exclude Mary from the line of succession. His advisors, however, told him that he could not disinherit only one of his half-sisters. He would have to disinherit Elizabeth as well, even though, like him, she was a Protestant. So Edward indeed excludes both Mary and Elizabeth from the line of succession. And in his will, he left the throne to his cousin, Jane Grey, while Mary assembles an army. And she quickly takes charge. She puts down the insurrections and assumes the throne, although for 9 days, technically, Jane Grey was Queen of England. Was Edward correct in his suspicions that Mary would attempt to return England to Catholicism? Yeah, you bet. Plots are hatched to depose Mary and put Elizabeth on the throne. Mary puts down all of these plots, 4 in total, and exiles Elizabeth to the Tower of London. Now, after a couple of months, she allows her to live at one of the estates under house arrest. And Mary does go about trying to restore Catholicism to England. And she makes it where heretics can be killed. Now, a heretic isn't simply anyone who wasn't Catholic. A heretic is someone who had once been Catholic, left the church, and refuses to return to Catholicism. Mary employed convert or die tactics, wherein 275 Protestants were burned at the stake. Now, this makes her fairly unpopular and leads to the moniker Bloody Mary. So if you're ever nursing a Saturday night hangover on a Sunday morning by having a Bloody Mary, that's who you're drinking. Mary's goal now, of course, like her father before her, is to have an heir, so she needs to find a husband. She settles on Prince Philip of Spain, a Catholic, but as she is the first woman to sit on the throne of England, except for technically Jane Grey, who retained power for 9 days, The idea of a husband brought into question whether or not he would therefore be the King of England and assume power as king. It was eventually determined that Philip and Mary would rule together, but for Mary's lifetime only, as the throne would then pass to their heir, be it son or daughter. After marrying Philip, the kingdom rejoices at the news of Queen Mary's pregnancy, and everyone is anxiously awaiting the arrival of the new baby to see if it's going to be a boy or a girl. And in the 9th month they're waiting, and then in the 10th and the 11th, and it becomes apparent she wasn't really pregnant. Awkward. They tend to believe it was a phantom pregnancy. She wanted it so badly she exhibited all the physical signs. Now this is traumatic for her. But she seems to get over it when she does get pregnant. Seemingly. But again, no baby. Her health is deteriorating, and at age 42, Queen Mary is dying. She reconciles with her sister Elizabeth and tells her she's going to have her assume the throne when she dies, just as their father wished. But she asks for her assurance that she will continue with Mary's quest of returning England to Catholicism. Elizabeth says, yes, sure, why not? With, of course, no intention of doing so, as it would obviously make her the bastard child and put into question the legitimacy of her being queen. Elizabeth ascends the throne and assumes a position of being against extreme Protestantism and extreme Catholicism. Well, this puts her at odds with a group of extreme Protestants who want all vestiges of the Catholic Church erased from their church. They want no signs left over at all, no altars, no crucifixes, no statues of the Virgin, etc. And these people are dubbed Puritans, those seeking complete purity from Catholic ritual. The Puritans think England has become too corrupt an environment in which to practice their faith and raise their children. So they move to the Netherlands. Now in the Netherlands, they come to believe that it is even more corrupt in their values. So the Puritans abandon the Netherlands and seek a new home in America. These Puritans are the Pilgrims. So this is the connection to British settlements in Massachusetts and Henry VIII. If Henry's brother Arthur hadn't died young, Henry wouldn't have married Arthur's wife Catherine and become king, and the Pope wouldn't have had to refuse Henry an annulment 24 years later. So there would likely have been no break with the Catholic Church, no Puritans, and thus no Pilgrims. Here then is the family tree of Henry VIII. He marries his dead brother's wife, Catherine of Aragon, has a daughter, Mary, and when no son is produced, he starts the Church of England and grants his own annulment and marries Anne Boleyn. He and Anne have a daughter, Elizabeth, but again no son. Henry has her head cut off and marries Jane Seymour, who does give him a son, Edward. Henry will marry 3 more times, Anne of Cleves, 15-year-old Catherine Howard, and the kindly Catherine Parr. Edward will ascend to the throne, but die young with no heir, leave the throne to his cousin Lady Jane Grey, and Mary will wrest power away from Jane and attempt to restore England to Catholicism by burning heretics at the stake. When she dies with no heirs, Elizabeth becomes the reigning monarch and sees the first British colonies in America come to fruition. But it is Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church that leads to Protestant Puritans migrating to the North American continent as pilgrims. Now, if you want to remember the fate of each of Henry's wives in order, there's a rhyme that goes divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survives. These are the 6 wives of Henry VIII.